George F. Kennan proposed a new strategy of information warfare against the Soviet Union, and it has been implemented in the Marshall Plan and other American operations. This strategy acted in the post-war decades and ultimately contributed to the disintegration of the USSR. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall, in his speech at Harvard University, one of the main centers of the information war against the Soviet Union, introduced the world to the European Recovery Program. Marshall said that the dollarization of Europe is a critical component of the information war against the Soviet Union in the economic and financial sphere. The dollarization of Europe after World War II was in the interests of the United States and the British Empire. Marshall offered assistance to a number of European and Asian countries, including former enemies, which in the end was supposed to prevent the growing influence of the Soviet Union in these countries. The United States Congress included the Marshall Plan in the Economic Cooperation Act of 1948. Joseph Stalin refused to participate in the plan, knowing the real intentions of British-American transnational capital. The fifth volume of essays on the history of Russian foreign intelligence notes that in 1948 the intentions of the United States, Britain and France to link the possibility of granting Western loans to the Soviet Union on terms that would put the Soviet economy under the control of Western capital were known. In the documented information about the position of the American leadership on the issue of granting loans to the Soviet Union, it was stated, for example, that with regard to a loan of $6 billion, it is assumed that the USSR can hardly succeed in getting such a loan. Even if the American government agrees to provide such a loan, it will provide individual loans in installments, in such a way that in exchange for the provision of each loan the American government can get any political concession. Thus there will be no guarantee that by getting one part of the loan the USSR will be able to get the remaining parts. The provision of such periodic loans will be negotiated each time. Pay attention to the fact that this technology, rejected by Stalin, was later used against Russia in the 1990s of the 20th century, when IMF loans were always accompanied by political demands. In the summer of 1947, at an international conference in Paris, 16 countries concluded the Convention on the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was about developing a joint European recovery program. The plan was launched in April of 1948. Assistance was provided from the federal budget in the form of American grants, supply of goods, and loans. From April of 1948 to December of 1951, the United States spent about $17 billion on the Marshall Plan, with the major share of it going to Britain, France, Italy and West Germany, where the Marshall Plan was distributed in December of 1949. Other important tasks were solved like this too. Financial and economic control of Europe by transnational corporations and banks, which gradually became the new geopolitical subjects of the new British Empire. Prerequisites for education emerged from 1944 to 1945 in the formation of a post-war international monetary system at a conference of 44 states in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States. Solutions of the Bretton Woods Conference were as follows. 1. The IMF and the ID Party were created, international monetary and financial institutions, whose task was to regulate the financial relations between the countries members of the new system. 2. Gold was restored as the international fare of the currency meter. 3. All countries pledged to maintain a steady course of their currencies to the dollar. 4. Interstate exchange markets appeared. For the first time in the existence of the concept of payment, a roll of international payments equivalent was acquired by plain paper. Those new dollars entered into circulation in 1927, just before the Great Depression. The dollars were printed by the Federal Reserve System, a private finance corporation of the British Empire. Let me remind you that this happened because in 1874 the East India Company of the British Empire ceased to exist. A new management model over colonies and the world was needed. For these purposes, the Round Table created in 1891 of the British Empire adopted the ingenious solution of establishing a private corporation of the British colonial type, a secret financial corporation of the British Empire, the Financial Department of Mile 6 and the Bank of England. In 1913 it was named the Federal Reserve. Therefore, it's not the American Federal Reserve that organized the dollarization of Western Europe but transnational structures supervised by Mile 6. There is only one principal difference between the Federal and the East India Company: product. The main item of the East India Company was opium. The dollar became the main item of the Federal. Post-war Europe was forced to accept dollars. Otherwise, it would have simply risked starvation. Recall how the British starved more than 40 million people in India in the 19th century. The infamous opium trade scheme of the East India Company was used by the Americans. The essence of the Marshall Plan was expressed in a few words by the author himself in 1947 in one of his Harvard lectures, calling it the continuation of war by other means, economic means. 2 years later the defensive NATO military alliance was created. Now the British Empire, taking the USA under secret control, was advancing on all fronts in its global expansion: military, financial, economic and ideological. Defeated Japan had to submit to the Marshall Plan. She was allocated $2.15 billion. All of Europe was allocated $12.4 billion, and it was initially planned to stretch the loans for 5 years, but then the money was invested in less than 3 years. In fact, the Marshall Plan was the first successful strategic financial globalist project aimed at achieving global domination by transnational corporations, managed from London. During the Second World War the printing press was turned on, and the real incomes of the American population increased almost twice. After the war, when arms production declined sharply, the dollar machine was turned off, but the inflationary billions of dollars had to be put somewhere. It was decided to throw the unsecured inventory dollars out of the USA with the Marshall Plan. And in order to ensure that they did not return, the concept of the euro dollar was developed, a set of measures to ensure the circulation of dollars just within the borders of Europe. On December 30, 1951, the Marshall Plan officially ceased to exist and was replaced by a law of mutual security, which provided simultaneous provision of economic and military aid. However, the flow of dollars increased even more. The peak occurred in 1966. 54 billion. But Charles de Gaulle directly told the Americans that all interstate calculations should be made in real gold. After the American backlash, France withdrew from the NATO military alliance, and on April 1, 1967, 35,000 American troops withdrew from France and 180 objects, which made up NATO infrastructure in France, were eliminated. Certainly, it was a very important moment for the revitalization of Soviet efforts to strengthen relations with France. However, the Soviet Union did not use the favorable geopolitical opportunities. Then, at the request of de Gaulle, the United States was forced to exchange dollars for 3,000 tons of gold from 1965 to 1967. The French-American confrontation started. Charles de Gaulle was the leader of the French statesmen who didn't fight against the United States but against American globalists. Later Germany, like de Gaulle, filed too. The Americans those remaining dollars in exchange for gold. And on August 15, 1971, the United States stopped exchanging dollars for gold, which was thundered by President Richard Nixon on television. The dollar ceased to be secured by gold in practice. Since the abolition of the dollar, it's been the obligation of the Federal Reserve System to pay the debt, decorated in paper or electronic form. With the abolition of the gold standard, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Federal, became free to choose the amount of dollars produced. Since then, the dollar, paper not backed by any assets, has been the main and the only real article of United States exports. It's more than super profitable. The Americans printed greenbacks of $100 for 4 cents and transported them on aircraft worldwide. This situation has created ideal conditions for the profits of the dealers from London, who created the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The organizational core of the North by East became the globalists of the United States and the British Empire. American globalists were gradually grown by British intelligence and, in fact, became a fifth column of the British Empire in the USA.